Hey, and welcome back. This week's video is a much requested one. In it, I'll explain how I spiral wedge my clay, and some tips and tricks that might help you out too. Spiral wedging is just one of many ways of mixing your clay. Compared to cut wedging or ram's head wedging, spiral wedging tends to just be a little bit faster, and equally it can be done to various sized lumps of clay, such as small, tiny ones, and even much larger lumps, like you'll see later on in this video. But first, let's get started with the basics. First and foremost, the height at which you stand at your workbench. Ideally, you want your hips to be at about the same level as the table. This way you can really use your upper body weight to help press down on the clay. I'm going to show you this process from numerous angles and explain it numerous times to help give you the best idea of what to do. I've always found at the beginning it helps if your block of clay has sort of a rectangular shape, which you want facing long ways away from you. I place 2 cupped hands on the far end and push down in a straight motion. Then I lift the form back up, and as I do, I twist it just a little bit to the left every single time before pushing it back down straight once again. And as I work, I'm making sure that all my movements are practically the same every single time. I push down with the same amount of pressure, and I rotate the mass of clay to the left the same amount every single time. Consistency is key here, and together with repeating the same movements over and over again, you want to make sure that your 2 hands stay in the same relative spot on the lump of clay. I'm not pushing down too hard, so that I smear the clay against the table. And you might notice that my hands actually act as a buffer between the clay and the table, so every time I push down, the clay hits my fingers rather than being smeared all over the wood. It's worth noting too that the consistency of the clay plays a huge role in how nice the form will look. So here we are again at the beginning, starting out with the clay lengthways away from me. With each push of the clay, I rock backwards and forwards on my feet, using my upper body weight to help with the process. With 2 hands, I push down on one portion of the clay at a time. This part is crucial, as if you change the position of where you're pushing from with each fold, there's no way you'll create such a regular shape. I push the clay down straight, and then every time I pull the clay up to the left, you can see it's just by a tiny bit. If you rotate it too much, again you won't keep a consistent shape, and you'll end up creating folds that are too large, and you might even start to incorporate air back into the mass of clay, which is exactly the opposite of what we want to be doing. This process essentially folds the clay into ever smaller and smaller spirals that compress and fold onto each other and eventually push all inconsistencies out and any air pockets too. What we want to end up with is a completely homogeneous spiral of clay that's ready to be thrown on the wheel or separated into smaller lumps of clay, like you'll see me do later towards the end of the video. As I begin to get towards the end of spiral wedging, I start to incorporate more and more of the clay using my right hand, and as I do so, I slowly use less and less pressure, which gradually pushes the air out, and I let the massive clay gradually roll out into more of a conical shape. Let's start again at the beginning. Here's my massive clay, and as you can see the inside is full of tiny little air pockets. This is reclaim taken off my plaster bat, and this will require much more wedging as compared to the clay taken out of the bag. And again, I start off with a sort of elongated rectangular shape, which by no means has to be perfect. I take the massive clay by one end, lift it, and push down straight. Then, taking the clay from the same position, I lift it up and twist it just a little bit to the left, before pushing the lump of clay back down again straight. The massive clay at this stage often looks like an awful mess, and it will do for a while. You've just got to keep repeating those 2 processes over and over again, whilst keeping your 2 hands firmly cupped around the same portion of clay. If you are using particularly soft clay, the surface on which you wedge on can be quite important. This table is built from 18mm birch ply and is quite absorbent, which is a quality you want, which is why you often see potters wedging on specially built plaster tables. But generally with this table, I just scrape away that really sticky layer and add it back to the mass of clay, and then continue wedging. And if one particular spot on your table does become too saturated, I just move to another. And now I repeat the process again, holding the clay at one end, pushing down straight, rotating to the left, and repeating. Wedging like this is one of those processes that definitely requires a huge amount of practice. It took me a year or so when I was first starting out, when I was age 17 or so. I spent hours and hours watching all kinds of YouTube videos on the process, but the absolute best tuition you can have for spiral wedging is having somebody who can do it standing next to you, and you both do the same process at the same time. That being said, it definitely is a skill you can teach yourself. It just requires a huge amount of persistence. The process almost becomes easier once you've formed the spiral shape. So another way of getting practice, if you have access to somebody who can spiral wedge, is to have them hand you over a piece that's half wedged, that has the shape well established. That way you can get a real good feel of what it's meant to feel like. It helps also not to worry too much about speed. In some of these clips you'll see me wedging really quite quickly, but at the beginning I'd say it's better to go slow and really practice getting the shape just right. Speed will just come naturally, you don't need to worry about it. It's more important to focus on your posture too. You really want to be above the clay using your upper body weight and rocking back and forward on your feet, especially when you're wedging larger masses of clay. Here's an example of clay that's just way too soft to spiral wedge. So if yours looks anything like this, don't bother. Simply leave the massive clay somewhere to dry, or do what I do, and many other potters too, which is roll it out into a long coil, and then just simply lay it out like an arch. We call it horseshoeing, but many other potters call it all kinds of things. I've heard rainbows, I've even heard dinosaurs. To each their own, I guess, and it all does the same thing anyway. Once that clay is dried out, it can be wedged up. Again, I begin with a block of clay that faces lengthways away from me. I cup one end and I push it straight down against the table. Then, as I lift, I twist it slightly to the left by about 10 or 15 degrees. Then I push down again, twist up, push down, twist up, push down, and so on. It's definitely a process where finding a rhythm helps. Together with keeping your motions consistent in the actual positions of your hands, you also want to be pushing down in a somewhat consistent motion too. Spiral wedging is most important for when you're throwing on the wheel, I think. As with hand building, you can sometimes get away with clay that contains just a little bit of air, but when throwing on the wheel, any air pockets or inconsistencies in the clay's texture can be totally detrimental. All it takes is one bad air bubble to ruin the entire pot you're making. Here you can see how I really wrap my fingers all the way around the head of clay. Doing so is important as it prevents you from smearing the clay in, like you'll see here when I demonstrate. So keeping your fingers wrapped around this point sort of prevents that from ever happening. Additionally, the amount of strength I use towards the very end of the push does lessen off slightly, as really it's my palms and the balls of my thumb that are folding in and pushing the clay at the beginning of each spiral, and for the most part, my 4 fingers on each hand are simply guiding the motion of the spiral, rather than doing any actual pushing. The number of times I wedge each lump really depends on the consistency of the clay to begin with. If it's clay taken fresh from the bag, which sometimes has a slightly harder outer layer, all I'm doing is wedging it enough to really incorporate all the consistencies. Whereas if it's reclaimed clay that's totally jam-packed full of bubbles, then I'll wedge it for a really good long time, maybe 100 or 200 spirals. By sticking a piece of metal into the spiral and wedging at the same time, you'll really be able to observe how the clay travels as you wedge. With each rotation of about 10 or 15 degrees, the piece of metal moves around the outside. Eventually it will get to where your hands are, and this is where all the spirals are really compressed and stretched out. And as the clay is stretched and firmly pressed against the table, you'll often even hear pockets of air bursting beneath your hands. Not all clays are the same, of course, so some clay bodies that are smoother might feel different underhand. With this one in particular, I can sort of feel when it's ready when the surface becomes tight and very smooth, whereas very grogged clays and very smooth clays will feel entirely different. The one sure way to check is just to cut it in half and take a look. And if you do this and find a few little air pockets left, you've just got to keep going. Here's another angle of the same spiral wedging process. As always, I start off with the clay lengthways away from me. I then pick it up from the far end and push it down straight. I then lift it up, and in the same motion of lifting it up, I'm twisting the clay about 10 or 15 degrees to the left. Previously I showed you what happens if your clay is too soft. Well, there are other times when your clay can be too hard to wedge, and sometimes you might not realise this until after you've been wedging for a little while. You'll likely feel pain in your wrists slightly, or just a very slight ache, and this occurs when the clay is just too hard, so usually I'll just soften it down with some reclaimed clay, or I'll search my bags of clay that I have stored for a very soft one, which I'll then mix with the harder clay. If I'm wedging clay to be stored in the studio, generally it's better if it's on the softer side, as even quite well wrapped up clay will harden over a couple of weeks and months. From watching other online videos of people spiral wedging, you might find that you come across some who spiral wedge the other way around, and by that I mean that their spiral goes to the left rather than to the right, like mine does. Initially I thought this was similar to how potters in the west throw with their wheel going anti-clockwise, and how potters in the east throw with their wheel going clockwise, but as far as I'm aware, it doesn't really work like that, and I've seen potters from all over the world do it either left or right. Even in Japan, when I spent 6 months there, they did it both ways. So presumably it just depends on maybe which is your more dominant hand, or perhaps even the videos you're watching might influence the direction which you spiral wedge. Either way, I don't think it makes too much of a difference. Here's the piece of metal inserted again, just to give you a clear visualization of how the clay moves as you spiral wedge. Hopefully it doesn't plunge into my hand. As you wedge beneath your two hands, that's where all the spirals culminate and all the concentric circles end up being squashed together, forcing any inconsistency out, any hard lumps of clay, air pockets, all of that squashed beneath your two hands. The one trick I missed is filming my entire body as I'm wedging, as really with each fold here, I'm letting all the upper body weight fall onto my shoulders and on my arms, and that's what's pushing the clay. It definitely isn't just my arms doing the work. And I think once you learn to fully incorporate your entire body into the motion of spiral wedging, things get a bit easier. But fundamentally, I think it is a very difficult process to explain because it's very simple, really. It's just a few very simple movements, but when it's done quickly, it can look quite complicated and very skilled, but I really don't think it is. You've just got to practice until the point where it's confined to your muscle memory, and then you'll never forget how to do it. Much like riding a bike, or even tap centering pots into the middle of the wheel, like I showed in another video. It's a skill that's very versatile too, as spiral wedging can almost be applied to any size lump of clay, save exceptionally large ones or very, very small ones. Here's one last angle showing how I wedge a sort of medium lump of clay from a view that's slightly behind me. Like I mentioned before at the beginning of the video, as you start this process, the first few folds, your lump of clay might look like a real mess. And back when I taught evening classes at Maze Hill Pottery for 3 years, often people beginning to learn how to spiral wedge would never get past this stage as they never saw their lump come into fruition. But as long as you're replicating those two basic movements, your lump of clay should begin to take on that classic spiral wedge look. It can also help at the beginning to be quite strict with the amount of clay you use. I'd say 3 or 4 kilos is a good starting place, and once you're comfortable with that weight, you can start scaling that up and down accordingly. Here's how a mass of clay might look midway through being wedged. You can quite clearly see each individual fold, and you can also see the spiral that's created. I also wouldn't worry about how your spirals look. For a long time mine looked quite messy and a bit clumsy. Really the beauty of the spiral wedge isn't the important thing. The important thing is that you're removing air properly. Then, as I approach the end of spiral wedging, I'll gradually apply less and less pressure with each fold, and very gradually your piece of clay will come to more of a cone shape, rather than the shell shape it was previously. The good thing about this final clip, which shows myself wedging a much larger lump of clay, is that I have to wedge more slowly. So this footage might be useful for those of you who really want to see the process slow down even more. Once again, the shape at the beginning is a bit of a mess, but on the left side of the lump of clay you can sort of see the rough beginnings of the shell-like pattern. And for a large piece of clay like this, I'm really using my body and my upper body weight to move the clay. I lean back on one foot and then lean forward on the other, and in that motion I push down on the clay. This is why the height at which you're standing is crucial for the ease at which you can wedge. As if the table was too high, you simply wouldn't be able to utilise your upper body weight and your shoulders, and you would be doing all the work with just your arms and your hands, which is a lot more tiring. In the footage right here, you can see nicely how much clay is folded beneath my palms with each press. For larger masses of clay like this, I'd say 50% of the time I spiral wedge, whilst the other 50% of the time I cut wedge. If you really have a lot of clay to get through, I think cut wedging is a lot less tiring. Of course a pug mill will do all of this work for you, but in your life you might find yourself in studios without pug mills, or you might be travelling, so being able to spiral wedge or ram's head wedge or cut wedge is a really fundamentally important skill in any potter's repertoire. These last few clips show how I wedge much smaller lumps of clay. This is just 1 pound of clay, or 453 grams in total. This is an amount of clay I can still more or less spiral wedge, although much more of the work is done in my palms and less with my fingers. Even my thumbs aren't really that involved. This is how I wedge up most of the clay for any of my bowl forms, and doing so leaves a nice convex shape on the bottom of the ball of clay, which means when I do slam it against the wheel head, there's no air trapped in that process. And lastly, here's how I wedge really small lumps of clay. They're pretty much just rolled and then slammed back down, which pushes any air out. And the process of repeating this step maybe 10 or so times is enough to completely homogenise the lumps of clay. This is a technique I only ever use for things that are perhaps 300 grams or less. Anything greater than that will need to be spiral wedged or cut wedged. And I should note, all of these pieces of weighed out clay here have already come from a much larger lump of clay that's already been spiral wedged or cut wedged. So really this process is just one that accumulates all the pieces that were weighed out together. That's all for this week. Good luck wedging, and see you next time.